If you watch my videos, you'll have gathered the dilemma with these mobile phones. Using a phone means you're going to be surveilled and profiled either by government or by big tech. The threats will be things like the Pegasus attack via the cell baseband modem, to Stingray, to flock profiling by Google using a device fingerprint. In this video, we're going to experiment with some technologies and see if we can mitigate the threats to our privacy and security with various solutions. This is experimental. I bought a few devices to play with in addition to a couple of devices I already have. And then what we'll do is analyze what threats would become ineffective with each technology and what threats would still exist. Some of these solutions might work for some of you, but even if it does not, the idea here is to understand the different privacy threats from different players and see which are defensible and which ones are not. And here's the first device for this experiment. This is a Netgear M1, which is an LTE Modem Router Hotspot. And this is the next device. It's a voice over IP system from Ooma, together with a handset. Next, I have a de-Googled phone here, but what's interesting with how I'm going to use this is that I won't have a SIM card on it, so it won't have cell service. And finally, my last device is a BraxRouter, which is a VPN router. I'll play around with various combinations of these and answer the question, can you hide yourself with these devices? Stay tuned. I'm on the platform Odyssey.com and I'm now one of the top creators on there. Just for insurance, in case I get deplatformed, please follow me there using the link in the description. I have a VPN service, BytzVPN. My company also sells de-Googled phones and VPN routers. These products are made to make your identity disappear on the internet. If you're interested in them, they are on my app BraxMe. The link is in the description. This is a solutions experiment video, so I'm not going to be explaining what the different threats are on the phone, but I invite you to check out two specific videos that give an introduction. Is there a phone backdoor? And the other video is what it's like to use a de-Googled phone in real life. Then there are so many videos addressing different threats and I will list them in the description. Suffice it to say that there are different threats which I will generally categorize as big tech surveillance, government Stingray, and state-level hackers. The first experiment we will conduct is to see what happens when we use a de-Googled phone with no SIM card together with a Netgear M1 modem router. Now, this experiment will actually mitigate several threats. First, by its design, a de-Googled phone is very interesting because it has no identity. You never log into the phone. And since there are no Google apps installed on it, there's no central tracking of things like a device ID and various carrier identifiers like the IMSI and the IMEI. So a de-Googled phone is an awesome solution by itself because it stops big tech tracking cold. This cannot be beaten by any iOS or Google Android phone. But one thing that it cannot protect against are state-level attacks like a SIMjacker attack, a Pegasus attack, or an SS7 attack because these focus on the cell baseband modem, which in reality is a separate computer on the phone, and all phones have a cell baseband modem. My guess is that these attacks work only because they utilize some backdoor on the baseband modem via hidden SMS or texting messages. But from my analysis, I believe that many of these attacks are possible only with a phone number and a SIM card. So once the SIM card is removed, I don't think the phone can be addressed by an attacker. Another threat that can be prevented is a government Stingray attack. A Stingray or IMSI catcher shouldn't work without a SIM card because the IMSI is in the SIM card and that's their primary mode of identification. My premise then is that without a SIM card and using just your home Wi-Fi, this kinds of attacks will fail. Since the attack source is SMS or texting, it should be clear that you cannot use SMS on the phone without a SIM card, so you have to rely on some alternate messaging solution. For example, your family can communicate with you using the app Signal, which you can use for messaging as well as for voice and video calls, all done through the internet. Additionally, you can still use apps on the phone like Kindle, Spotify, and so on, as long as you have a Wi-Fi connection. You can watch my video on de-Googled phones to know what you can do and what you cannot do on the phone. But having no SIM card poses a problem. If you're not near any Wi-Fi, for example, while in a car, you cannot communicate, and of course, it's a pain to constantly be looking for Wi-Fi and finding the password to it. So the solution I came up with is to pair the de-Googled phone with a portable LTE router. This particular one that I've found is quite a device. The Netgear M1. One thing that's unique about this device is the speed. It has a newer chipset with the ability to do something called LTE Advanced. This can potentially work as fast as your home DSL if you have 4 bars or so, and you can even extend the antennas. Now, it's not small enough to put in a pocket, but it is definitely portable. The battery can last 20 plus hours, and if you turn it off when it's not being used, it could potentially last for a few days. This uses a standard USB-C connector, so you can charge it using normal phone chargers, even in your car. Remember, this is an LTE modem, which of course means it needs a SIM card. And you might say that that would defeat the purpose, since a SIM card can cause it to be vulnerable to various backdoors and attack points at the cell baseband modem. Because yes, a Netgear M1 has to have a cell baseband modem. But here's the difference. This is a standalone device. The baseband modem is not connected to a mobile phone. In my video on phone backdoors, I discussed that the memory of a phone is shared by the cell baseband modem. So it was possible to attack a phone directly and do things like steal photos and files from a device, read text, initiate phone calls, track GPS position, and so on. Well, lo and behold, you cannot do any of this on a Netgear M1 router because it doesn't have a GPS sensor or any motion sensors as far as I know. There's no capability to make a call or send a text. There's no hardware for it. This device is data only, so the only thing that can theoretically be intercepted is the internet connection. But let's just say I turn on the VPN on my phone, the phone I'm using with the Netgear. So the phone is de-Googled, no SIM, using the Wi-Fi of the Netgear M1 LTE router and using VPN for encryption. Then at that point, the ISP can no longer see anything but encrypted traffic, because the phone itself is isolated from the cell baseband modem of the carrier. It's looking pretty tight. This Netgear LTE modem, by the way, is not slow. I happen to only get 3 bars at the most at this location, and I'm getting 42 megabits per second download and 17 megabits per second upload. I'm using a T-Mobile service. Just for comparison, the plan T-Mobile gave me for this is $50 a month, which is a 100 gigabyte plan for full throughput, and it goes to a slower service after 100 gigabytes. Apparently, the reason it operates faster is that it does something called carrier aggregation, which I believe means the device makes multiple cell connections and then combines the bandwidth of the connections. It also receives data from 4 separate antennas. One other thing I can tell you about using the Netgear M1 LTE router. Each time I turn it on and off, I get a different IP address. Now, why is this important? Since most of the tracking on the internet occurs using IP addresses, this piece of data, the IP address, will be meaningless to attackers since it will not persist for the long run when using a Netgear M1. In other words, it functions similarly to a VPN, with the exception that the carrier does know who you are. I mentioned earlier that a government Stingray can't target a phone without a SIM card. Well, it can't target much on the Netgear M1 either, since the only thing flowing through it would theoretically be encrypted traffic. No phone calls and texts. You can also use this device as an alternative home router instead of using DSL. There's an Ethernet port in the back and you can expand the network that way. You can even make it so it becomes a substitute for your cable modem. Now, let's analyze the problems with this solution. 1. It's not that portable. You have to carry the Netgear M1 with you at all times. If you're a woman, you can leave it on your handbag, so it may be doable then, but it's too big for pocket use. Second, you can only communicate using phone, voice, or video using apps. There is no texting capability, so you have to rely on messaging apps and email. However, the phone side is not a dead end. It depends on how far you want to go to risk your privacy. You could use Skype or Viber on a Google phone that has no SIM card, and that is able to make direct calls to any phone number. And there are other similar applications that can do this. Both Skype and Viber are voice over IP apps, and we will be talking about voice over IP next, and that has pluses and minuses too. Alternatively, you're able to use voice over IP apps on this phone so it can function normally for phone calling purposes, though it may seem inconvenient, but that's the price of being able to hide. By the way, if you're an active surveillance target of law enforcement, then you can't hide with this device. So this is not an aid for criminals. A government can determine your Netgear M1's IMEI, IMSI, and so on based on how the account was set up with the carrier. They can also find all the IP addresses that they've ever given to you over time. However, this is not too significant of a threat for normal people because nothing much can be acquired other than that you were on the internet at a particular time. The bigger threat is that it's possible to track the approximate location of a cell device, like a Netgear M1 using cell tower triangulation. Triangulation might give you a 1/2 mile square area or larger depending on the number of towers. This is not that exact though on LTE. On 5G this will be more of an issue since the beamforming can pinpoint your exact location. But it is possible to search for a device by its IMSI by flying a drone or aircraft searching for a specific IMSI within a mile square area, for example. So generally this solution is amazing for privacy, but not too portable, and certainly missing conveniences. But for those wanting to go the extra mile, like the Snowdens and McAfee's of the world, then it's an approach. Not perfect, but it can do a great job unless a government puts in an active surveillance on you, especially if they know who you are, in which case you need to really talk off-grid. Next, let's talk about another device, which is the Ooma. This is a voice over IP solution. Voice over IP or VoIP allows you to connect to the phone network, which is called the Public Switch Telephone Network, PSTN, over the internet. If a voice over IP provider provides a gateway to the Public Switch Telephone Network, then you can make and receive calls on an internet phone device like this. This Ooma device here comes with a base unit. This was the Ooma Telo Air 2 model, which actually came with a wireless handset as well. I believe I paid $89 for this. An Ooma device requires internet. It can connect to a router using an Ethernet cable. It can also connect to any Wi-Fi, so you don't have to do any wires. It just needs internet, and then using the identifier in the base station here, it connects to the Ooma HQ, and then Ooma manages your incoming and outgoing calls to the PSTN. This device is always connected to the Ooma HQ, so it is able to ring immediately if a call is received for your number at Ooma HQ. So what makes this device interesting? For one, it's a landline replacement. It's pretty cheap to operate actually. You just pay taxes of approximately $5 to $6 per month. There's no other cost unless you subscribe to Ooma's premium services, which are completely optional. A landline is not used that often, so this is pretty good as a replacement. The sound quality is very good if your internet is good. It can also be paired with the Netgear M1. The phone number will stay with the base station even if you change internet connections. The advantage of using a Netgear M1 with it is that you don't have to reconfigure anything, including the Wi-Fi. As long as the wireless is on, it will work immediately. Although you can pre-program multiple Wi-Fis on it, so you don't have to reset that. Now, what are the privacy and security advantages to this? Well, the first advantage is that the phone is not a smartphone, so there's no data on the phone to be captured. There's no SIM card to be hacked, no cell baseband modem, no files and photos. No apps with telemetry, no identity or locations to pass to third parties or big tech. It's basically like the old wired phones. It's even safer than a flip phone since there's no SIM card. And you can add several wireless voice over IP phones in your house with this, and they all connect to the base station just like any old wireless phone of the old days. Is this any better than using a Google phone without a SIM card? Well, yes it is, because you can get a real phone number and then your friends and family can reach you the normal way. The Ooma base station also acts as an answering machine, so it can record the messages and even email to you if you wish. As I said before, a de-Googled phone without a SIM card can only communicate using some app like Skype to the outside world of a normal phone network, or you stick to communications within a messaging app like Signal. But the advantage of a physical phone is, of course, simplicity. A low-tech family can take advantage of it. If you have a Netgear M1, you could then pack up your phone with you on vacation and your phone number is the same, and you could turn it on in your hotel room or your vacation spot. As long as there's cell service for the Netgear M1. And being just a regular voice over IP phone with very little in terms of additional functionality, you're also not an easily reachable target of hackers. Let me tell you about a cool feature with the Ooma. I can make and receive calls using the phone number of the Ooma phone even remotely. You can do this by running an Ooma app, and I found that this works even on my de-Googled phone. So I can leave the Ooma unit at home and have the benefit of voice over IP but using only the app. I think that this is likely the most practical way of using this instead of lugging all this equipment around. I can make and receive calls, and it does ring the mobile device that has no SIM. Again, you don't need a SIM card to have this functionality. If you're using a Netgear M1, this will allow you to make actual calls with just an internet connection, and without using a Skype or Viber, which need a subscription to make a phone call. By the way, this video is not sponsored. There are other voice over IP devices. This seems to be the most sophisticated one for home use. There are competitors like MagicJack, Vonage, RingCentral, and some app-only providers like Skype and Viber. This seems to be the most user-friendly setup that I found, but I will keep looking for similar products in the future. Now, this is not perfect either, so let's talk about the disadvantages. Once again, there is no SMS texting, so you have to rely on some other alternative method of communicating instead of using text. Because of habits of most people and the use of phones for calling has declined, I would say that not having SMS is the biggest disadvantage of any of these solutions. Of course, you can always have a standard de-Googled phone with a SIM card, and I still expect most people will just use it like that. And then you can choose to remove the SIM card occasionally as needed. The next disadvantage, of course, is the bulk of all of this. Just the fact that each device requires a separate charger is already a big pain. The Netgear, though, can be charged using a normal phone charger. The Ooma requires two wall warts, one for the handset and one for the Ooma base station. It would have been nice if the Ooma base station had a battery so you can disconnect for periods of time. But it doesn't have that included. I believe you can buy a USB battery though. The handset does have a battery, so at least that does not always need to be plugged in. As I said earlier though, you could just leave the device at home and use the Ooma app, so the bulk isn't necessary. Even if you go abroad, the phone number is the same, and you do not need any SIM cards, just an internet connection either via Wi-Fi or wired, or you can use a Netgear M1, which is the one with the SIM card. By the way, one thing that is not obvious with voice over IP is that it is subject to the CALIA law, just like any other mobile phones. CALIA is the Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act in the US. The law requires that the voice over IP provider, just like the cell carrier, have the equipment to do wiretapping as required by law enforcement. Although, to be honest, I'm wondering how much of this matters in today's world, since we can all use a Signal app if we need to, and most people do texting and very little calling. But it has to be stated, CALIA applies to voice over IP as well as regular voice and text. The next device I'll introduce is a VPN router. This is one of my own products called the BraxRouter. And I want to talk about it only in conjunction with the Netgear M1. It just needs to be plugged into the Ethernet port of the Netgear M1 router, and then it's good to go with a Wi-Fi connection. That's routing all your traffic through the VPN. Optionally, instead of a VPN router, we can also load VPN software on every device that will access the internet on the Netgear, which is tedious for a family, but it is doable for a single person using this with a couple of devices. The problem here is the Ooma voice over IP. Since this is a separate piece of hardware, we have no way of loading a VPN on it. If you want to VPN the Ooma, then the only solution is a VPN router. So the simple solution is to have a BraxRouter. If you equip your Netgear M1 with a BraxRouter, then you never have to worry about any device not having a VPN. Just connect to the BraxRouter instead of direct to the Netgear M1. It's just another Wi-Fi after all. This kind of configuration will work on the go since the only requirement of a BraxRouter is that there be an Ethernet port, and a Netgear M1 has an Ethernet port. Now of course here's another device to connect to the chain, and that introduces more setup complexity, especially if you're trying to use it on the go. For most cases it is enough to load the VPN on each individual computer or phone, and the Netgear M1 already rotates the IP addresses anyway. But a VPN will make you invisible to the carrier. If you want a complete solution with the utmost level of security and privacy, it's hard to beat. Obviously, these solutions are not convenient. Hiding is not easy. This is the reason many are drawn to using your smartphones, because everything is easy to do. However, that ease of use comes with so many compromises on privacy that people wonder if there are alternatives. I just want to give you food for thought. Alternatives that may mitigate privacy risks. Some of this may be a big sacrifice for you, but to some it may be acceptable. To summarize the possibilities, the Google phones without a SIM card, paired with a Netgear M1 LTE router, voice over IP hardware like the Ooma added to this mix, used as an app or a physical phone, and maybe adding a VPN router like BraxRouter to make sure even the Ooma is VPN'd. I hope you find my videos of value. If you do, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get more of this content. You can support the cause by joining us on Patreon or checking out our VPN routers, and Google phones in my store on BraxMe. Thank you for watching.